Snow blankets, Sun Valley as Claire, a dedicated executive assistant, wipes the exhaustion from her eyes. She has spent years perfecting schedules, covering for colleagues, and quietly carrying the weight of her mother's medical bills. But one winter night, a single unexpected encounter with Ethan, a successful and enigmatic CEO, changes the course of her life forever. What begins as a fleeting connection, a shared conversation over the crackling fire, spirals into consequences neither of them could predict. Months later, Claire stands in a modest home on Whidbey Island, staring out over a quiet bay. 3 tiny lives depend entirely on her. How did she get here, and how will she face the man who holds both the key to her past and the possibility of her future? Ethan is powerful, wealthy, and full of secrets. But can he embrace the responsibilities that love demands, from unexpected pregnancies to secret tests, from whispered fears to newfound trust? This story navigates the fragile spaces between duty and desire, independence and family, fear and courage. Will love survive the mistakes, misunderstandings, and storms that life throws at them? Join us on this journey of heartache, hope, and healing. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow. Claire and Ethan's unforgettable story. The snow fell in heavy curtains outside the lodge, soft flakes swirling beneath the amber glow of lanterns that lined the path. Inside, the retreat center had grown silent. The last bursts of laughter and clinking glasses had long faded, leaving only the low hum of the furnace and the crackle of firewood deep in the hearth. At 1 a.m, the grand hall felt both luxurious and hollow. Claire Bennett sat at a polished oak table near the lobby, her laptop casting a pale light across her tired face. She adjusted her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and tried to refocus on the final pieces of the next day's schedule. Her job demanded precision shuttles to the slopes at dawn, client luncheons timed down to the minute, reservations confirmed twice over. She had built her reputation as the dependable assistant who could carry the weight of an entire executive team on her shoulders. But tonight, the weight felt heavier than usual. Her annual bonus had been cut that afternoon, a decision delivered casually over cocktails, as if numbers on a spreadsheet mattered more than the woman behind them. The cut wasn't abstract. It meant another delay on her mother's medical treatments, another month of juggling bills, another night of lying awake wondering if she could stretch her paycheck further without breaking. All around her, managers had toasted to optimizing costs, their glasses raised high in the glow of firelight, while she smiled thinly and swallowed her frustration. Now, alone in the quiet, she felt the sharp edge of exhaustion. She longed to crawl into bed, to bury her face in a pillow and let the tears come. But the schedules wouldn't write themselves. She didn't hear him approach at first. The sound of polished shoes on carpet was softer than the wind rattling the windows. It wasn't until the shadow stretched across her laptop screen that she looked up. Ethan Whitaker stood there, the CEO himself, tall and imposing even in casual slacks and a wool sweater. His reputation was a mixture of admiration and fear. To some, he was the genius who had turned a struggling family business into a national empire. To others, he was a storm in human form, unyielding, calculating, and unreachable. Still at it, he asked, his voice low, touched with something between surprise and curiosity. Claire's fingers froze above the keyboard. Of all people, she hadn't expected him to find her there. She nodded, forcing a professional smile, just finalizing tomorrow's agenda. At this hour, his gaze lingered on the dark circles under her eyes. Everyone else is asleep or nursing brandy. I like to finish what I start, she replied, more defensive than she intended. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire snapped in the distance, releasing the scent of pine. Then Ethan leaned slightly closer, lowering his tone. You should rest. Claire, the company won't fall apart if the shuttle schedule isn't color-coded tonight. She let out a breath, half laugh, half sigh. Maybe not. But I can't afford mistakes. Something flickered in his expression, an understanding rarely glimpsed behind his usual armor. He gestured toward the chair across from her. Mind if I sit? She hesitated, Every rule in the unspoken handbook said it was better to keep distance. Assistants weren't supposed to share midnight conversations with CEOs, but fatigue softened her caution. She nodded. Ethan sat, stretching his long frame with an ease that contrasted her taut posture. For a few moments, silence settled again, broken only by the whistle of wind against the glass. Then he asked, "Why do you drive yourself this hard?" The question pierced more deeply than he could have known. Claire hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Words slipped out anyway, perhaps because it was late, perhaps because the loneliness pressed too heavily on her chest. "My mother's medical bills," she admitted. "I cover them, and rent, and everything else. I can't let anything slip, not when every dollar counts." His brows drew together. She had expected him to offer a polite nod, maybe shift the subject. Instead, he studied her with a rare stillness. "That's a lot for one person to carry." "I don't really have a choice," she whispered. The words hung there. She realized she had just cracked the shell she wore at work. For years she had mastered the art of being efficient, polished, untouchable. But in that moment, she was simply a daughter holding together a fragile life with both hands. To her surprise, Ethan didn't dismiss it. He leaned back, gaze fixed on the snow drifting outside. "I grew up here in Idaho, winters like this. My father used to make us shovel the driveway before dawn. No excuses, responsibility first. Always." His voice carried a shadow of something regret. "Maybe it taught me discipline, but it also taught me how heavy expectations can feel." Claire's chest tightened. Beneath the CEO's precision and power, she glimpsed a man who knew something about weight. They talked for longer than she expected, about family, about choices, about the invisible burdens that shape them. She found herself laughing softly at his dry humor, surprised that he even had some. And each time she looked into his eyes, she saw not just command but a trace of vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. The hours blurred. When she finally closed her laptop, the clock read nearly 3. She felt dizzy with fatigue, but also with the strangeness of connection. What happened next unfolded like stepping into a dream she hadn't known she was carrying. Neither of them had planned it. Neither could have written the rules for it. But somewhere between weariness and unspoken need, lines blurred. The night became something unforgettable, something that would change them both. And then, morning. The light over the mountains was sharp, merciless. Claire dressed quickly in her small room, her hands trembling as she tucked her blouse into her skirt. Every glance at the mirror reminded her that she had crossed a line. At breakfast, she avoided his eyes. The weight of rules and consequences pressed harder than any midnight snow. By the time she returned to her desk, the decision had already hardened inside her. She would request a transfer. She could not keep working side by side with him, not after what had happened. Ethan, for his part, kept distance so absolute it almost felt like rejection. But she saw the tension in his jaw, the way he refused to linger near her, the way his voice carried steel when addressing the team. It was his form of protection, perhaps for both of them. That afternoon, Claire packed her notes, boarded a shuttle, and left Idaho behind. She stared at the snowy ridges through the frosted window, her heart heavy with confusion and regret. Back in the lodge, Ethan stood once more before the fire, face carved in stone, shoulders squared as though nothing had ever happened. The CEO had returned. The man from the night before was gone. But the silence between them carried more than memory. It carried the weight of something unfinished, something that neither of them could yet name. Morning light filtered through the blinds of Claire's small apartment in downtown Seattle, painting thin golden stripes across her unmade bed. She had barely slept. The nausea had come in waves, waking her at odd hours, leaving her clammy and unsettled. At first, she told herself it was the stress of travel, the long days in Sun Valley, the endless stream of details that clung to her even in dreams. But as she stumbled toward the bathroom, clutching her stomach, she knew this was something more. Her hands shook as she tore open the small white box from the drugstore. The instructions blurred before her eyes. Though she had read them before, in younger years when fear and possibility lived in the same breath. She placed the test on the counter, staring at the floor tiles as the minutes crawled past. 2 pink lines, bold, undeniable. Claire sank onto the closed lid of the toilet, her chest tightening as the truth settled in. She was 35 years old, the trusted executive assistant to one of the most powerful men in Seattle, and she was pregnant after a single night that never should have happened. Her mind spun. How could she explain this without looking like she had schemed it? How could she expect him to believe that she hadn't planned, hadn't trapped shame rose in her throat? Mingling with fear, she thought of her mother's face, frail and tired from long treatments, and wondered how she would react to this news. She thought of Ethan's cool distance after that night, the way he had folded himself back into the role of CEO as if nothing had changed. There was no way she could tell him now. Still shaking, she made an appointment at a local clinic. Days later, sitting in a sterile room with walls painted a calming shade of blue, she clutched the thin paper gown around her body as the ultrasound technician moved the wand across her stomach. "There it is," the technician murmured, turning the screen so Claire could see. Strong heartbeat. Relief rushed through her, quickly tangled with disbelief. Then the woman's brow furrowed, and she adjusted the angle. "Wait, I'm hearing more than one." Claire's pulse spiked. "More than one." "Yes," the technician confirmed gently. "You're carrying 3 triplets." The room tilted. Claire gripped the edge of the table, tears filling her eyes. Triplets. She hadn't been prepared for 1 child, let alone 3. She thought of the bills stacked on her kitchen counter, the modest balance in her checking account, the long hours she had worked just to keep afloat. And now, 3 little lives growing inside her. When the appointment ended, she walked through the city streets in a haze. The cold February air bit her cheeks, but she hardly noticed. She wrapped her coat tighter around her, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, as if to shield the fragile miracle within. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a pad of paper, making lists: rent, groceries, doctor visits, diapers, car seats, cribs. Her neat handwriting filled page after page until the numbers became unbearable. She pressed the pen down so hard it tore the paper. Something had to change. She couldn't raise 3 children while maintaining a high-pressure job in the heart of the city. Surrounded by whispers and suspicions, she couldn't stay in Ethan's world. The next morning, she handed in her resignation. The HR manager blinked in surprise, tried to persuade her to reconsider, but Claire smiled politely and insisted it was time. By the end of the week, she packed her belongings into boxes, left her ID badge on the desk, and walked away from the tall glass building that had defined so many years of her life. Seattle had always felt sharp and hurried, a place of ambition and constant motion. She needed somewhere softer now, somewhere that would let her breathe. After searching listings late into the night, she found a modest rental house in Langley on Whidbey Island. It was nothing grand, just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fenced yard with a weathered swing set left behind by previous tenants. But the view of the water was wide and calming, and the price was something she could almost manage. With boxes stacked high in her second-hand car, she drove onto the ferry and watched the city skyline shrink behind her. The water stretched endlessly, gray and still, as if urging her toward a quieter life. The house smelled faintly of salt and cedar when she unlocked the door. The floorboards creaked under her steps, the kitchen cabinet stuck slightly when opened, and the heater rattled before sighing into warmth. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She unpacked slowly, placing her mother's crocheted blankets on the back of the sofa, setting mugs in the chipped cabinets, arranging her few books on the narrow shelf. She pinned the ultrasound photo to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lighthouse, staring at it each time she passed. 3 tiny pulses of life, 3 futures depending entirely on her. She began to make lists again, this time of what the babies would need. Diapers stacked in the corner, 3 cribs squeezed into the second bedroom, a stroller wide enough for 3. She wrote down appointments: 12 weeks, 16, 20. She taped the schedule to the fridge beside the photo. Money stretched thin. Claire picked up freelance work where she could, editing newsletters for a local nonprofit, writing small community features for the island paper. At night, she knitted simple baby hats in soft yarn and sold them online, each dollar a step towards security. The clatter of needles became her new soundtrack, steady and grounding. Though fear pressed against her daily, she found comfort in the rhythm of small routines. Morning walks along the waterfront, tea steeping on the stove, the gentle kick of life inside her. She talked to her belly sometimes, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, but wanted to believe in. The thought of Ethan lingered at the edges of her mind, his face at the retreat, the rare softness in his voice, the weight of his silence afterward. But each time the memory surfaced, she pushed it down. To reach out would risk everything. Better to stay silent, better to stand on her own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the water copper, Claire sat by the window with her hands folded over her stomach. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt both lonely and safe. She watched the ferry glide across the bay, its lights twinkling like stars, and whispered into the stillness. "I'll protect you," she said softly, her words for all 3 children she carried, no matter what it takes. Her reflection in the glass looked fragile, but there was steel in her voice. Outside, the bay stretched calm and endless, a mirror of the promise she had just made. The hallway lights at the Seattle hospital glared bright and cold, a line of neon that stretched endlessly down polished linoleum. Claire sat hunched on a folding chair outside the NICU, her coat wrapped tight around her, even though the room was kept warm. Her body still ached from labor, her mind fogged with fatigue, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Every beep from the monitors behind the glass pulled her attention back, sharp as a knife. She had known from the start that this pregnancy carried risks. The doctors had warned her again and again triplets were rarely carried to full term. There had been weekly checkups, iron infusions, lectures about blood pressure, and long lists of things that could go wrong. Still, she had hoped she might beat the odds. She had whispered promises to her children in the quiet hours, telling them they were strong, that they would make it. But her babies had arrived early, too early. The NICU smelled of antiseptic and faint latex. Machines lined each incubator, blinking and humming, a steady rhythm of life and fragility. Claire pressed her forehead against the glass, eyes moving from one tiny body to the next. Owen's chest rose and fell in uneven spurts. Caleb's fist twitched inside his blanket. June's lips moved in a silent suckle. They were impossibly small, each barely more than 4 pounds, their skin translucent, their cries thin and uncertain. She ached to scoop them into her arms, to press her cheek against their hair, but the nurses told her to wait. For now, her role was limited to slipping a hand through the porthole of the incubator, resting her palm gently on their backs, whispering that she was there. Hours passed that way, days blurred into nights, nights into days. The hospital cafeteria coffee became her constant companion. She carried notebooks filled with feeding schedules, weight logs, and medical jargon she barely understood. Her body was weak, still recovering, but her will held her upright. There was no man at her side to hold her hand, no one to share the long vigils beneath the buzzing lights. Other mothers had husbands sleeping in recliners, grandparents hovering with flowers, friends bringing warm casseroles. Claire had only herself. Still, she learned how to adjust the tiny knitted hats on fragile heads, how to read the difference between a hungry cry and an anxious one, how to soothe her children with the steady rhythm of her voice. She hummed lullabies her mother used to sing, filling the sterile air with fragments of comfort. Weeks later, when the doctors finally declared the babies stable enough to go home, Claire packed them into 3 infant car seats that nearly filled the back seat of her old sedan. The drive to Whidbey Island felt surreal, 1 woman and 3 tiny passengers embarking on a life that would demand everything from her. The little house by the water became their world. Claire transformed the 2nd bedroom into a nursery, lining 3 cribs shoulder to shoulder, their rails brushing against one another. She bought diapers in bulk, stacked formula cans in the pantry, labeled shelves with careful order. The washing machine ran constantly, the scent of baby detergent clinging to every corner of the home. Her days quickly turned into cycles, feeding every 3 hours, burping, changing, soothing, then laundry, dishes, bills. She taped charts to the fridge, marking down ounces consumed, hours slept, fevers feared. Some nights, all 3 babies cried at once, their wails weaving together until her nerves trembled. She would rock one in her arms while bouncing another in a bouncer with her foot, her body aching for rest she never found. Money remained tight. She took freelance assignments during rare quiet hours, her laptop perched on the kitchen table while bottles dried beside her. She wrote newsletters for local nonprofits, edited articles for the island paper, and managed to earn enough to keep the lights on. To stretch further, she sold hand-knitted hats online, mailing packages wrapped in brown paper and twine. Each order was a small victory, a sign she could build something of her own. The island community began to notice. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles and soups, leaving them on the porch when she was too tired to chat. An older woman from down the street offered to hold a baby now and then, giving Claire a half-hour to nap. At the farmer's market one Saturday, she struck up a conversation with a kind stranger, a woman with chestnut hair and a gentle voice named Lydia. Lydia seemed familiar somehow, though Claire couldn't place it. They talked about the babies, about island life, about simple recipes for when time was short. Lydia held June for a while, her eyes soft with something unspoken. Claire never asked about her last name, too grateful for the help to dig deeper. As months passed, Claire began writing about her experiences in a small online blog. She called it Simple Living with Triplets, sharing tips on managing chaos with grace, photos of thrift store finds, reflections on finding beauty in exhaustion. She wrote about the joy of hearing 3 giggles at once, the pride of making ends meet, the lessons of resilience. To her surprise, the blog found readers beyond the island. Mothers from across the country left comments, thanking her for her honesty, cheering her on. But behind the brave words, Claire's body struggled. Fatigue pressed against her bones. Her iron levels dropped again, and dizzy spells became more frequent. Some days, she caught herself gripping the kitchen counter to stay upright, willing herself not to collapse. The pressure of 3 infants, financial strain, and the absence of a partner bore down relentlessly. There were nights when she stared at her phone, Ethan's number hovering in her contacts. Her thumb lingered over the call button, heart pounding with temptation, but she never pressed it. She couldn't. To call him would be to open the door to judgment, to suspicion, to the very fears that had driven her away. So she carried on, silent and steadfast. One evening, rain hammered the roof, wind rattling the old windows of the house. The babies finally slept, their soft breaths rising and falling in the dim light of the nursery. Claire sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, typing slowly. Her blog entry that night wasn't about tips or tricks. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for neighbors who left casseroles, for readers who sent kind words, for the small resilience that grew stronger with each challenge. When she finished, she closed her eyes, listening to the storm outside. The world could rage all it wanted. Inside her little home, 3 children slept, and she was still standing. The living room of Ethan Whitaker's Seattle penthouse was awash with late afternoon light. Glass walls overlooked Lake Union, boats drifting slowly across the water, their white sails catching the last traces of sun. The television played softly in the background, a local station covering weekend community stories. He usually ignored this kind of news. His life was filled with board meetings, investment calls, and reports stacked thick on his desk. But that day, as he moved past the screen carrying a glass of sparkling water, an image stopped him cold. 3 children, toddlers, round-cheeked and bright-eyed, tumbling in the grass of a small island park. The caption read, "Local mother of triplets inspires community." His breath caught. He knew those eyes, clear, gray-blue, framed by lashes darker than seemed possible. He had seen them once before in the mirror. His hand tightened on the glass until it nearly slipped. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, leaning closer as the reporter's voice carried on. Claire Bennett, a single mother here in Langley, has been raising her triplets with remarkable resilience. Community members describe her as hardworking, creative, and determined. Her blog on simple living with 3 children has gained followers across the country, inspiring parents with her honesty and courage. The camera shifted, and there she was, Claire. She stood in a modest yard, hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing a sweater that looked well-loved. She held one child on her hip while the other 2 clung to her legs. All laughter and squeals. Claire's smile was tired but radiant, her eyes carrying both weariness and joy. Ethan felt the air rush out of his lungs. Memories of that snowy night in Sun Valley crashed over him, her laughter echoing near the fire, the softness in her eyes when she let her guard slip, the warmth of her hand against his. He had locked those memories away, convincing himself it had been a single mistake, a fleeting weakness never to be revisited. And now, here she was, with 3 children who looked unmistakably like him. 3 years he had not known. Anger rose hot and sharp, tangled with disbelief and something deeper he dared not name. Why hadn't she told him? Did she think he would abandon them? Did she believe he would turn cold, write checks, and vanish? Or had she assumed he would try to control her life, strip away her independence? He muted the television, pressing his fingers to his temple. For the first time in years, the man who prided himself on control felt utterly unmoored. That evening, he called his sister. Lydia answered, her voice warm as always. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he demanded, skipping any greeting. There was a pause. "So, you saw the story," she said quietly. You knew his tone cut sharp, though underneath was a tremor of hurt. "I met her by chance at the farmer's market," Lydia admitted. "I didn't know how to bring it up. I thought maybe she would tell you when she was ready." Ethan turned toward the glass wall, staring at the fading skyline. "They're mine, aren't they?" Lydia didn't answer immediately. "They have your eyes, Ethan, but more than that, they have her strength. You need to see for yourself." When the call ended, he poured himself a drink he barely touched. He stood for a long time, watching the dark settle over the lake, the city lights flickering alive. His reflection in the glass looked hollow, a man stripped bare. He thought of the years lost, the first steps he hadn't seen, the first words he hadn't heard. A wave of regret nearly buckled his knees. But beneath it, something harder formed resolve. He would not lose another day. The next morning, he boarded the ferry to Whidbey Island. The air was damp with salt, gulls circling above as the boat cut across the gray water. He stood at the railing, coat pulled tight against the wind, rehearsing what he would say. Anger and longing tangled inside him, leaving him restless. The town of Langley was quiet, its main street lined with small shops and cafes. He found her house easily, the white fence, the modest garden, the toys scattered on the porch. For a long moment he stayed in the car, his hand gripping the steering wheel, pulse hammering. Then he forced himself out, walking up the path. Claire answered the door with June in her arms. Her face drained of color when she saw him. The child squirmed, reaching for a toy, oblivious to the storm between adults. "Ethan," she whispered, his name brittle on her lips. "He didn't ask to come in. We need to talk." His voice was low, restrained, but iron threaded every word. She stepped back, letting him into the small living room. The house smelled faintly of laundry detergent and apples. 3 small coats hung on hooks by the door, shoes lined up neatly on a mat. It was a world built without him. He looked around, then back at her. "They're mine." It wasn't a question. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. "I want a test," he said, "not because I doubt what I see, but because I need the truth recorded. I need it undeniable." She hugged June closer, her silence a wall. That silence cut him deeper than any denial. To him, It felt like confirmation that she had hidden them intentionally, choosing to raise his children alone rather than risk his presence. The tension thickened until even the tick of the wall clock felt sharp. Ethan's chest burned with a mixture of fury and sorrow. Each breath jagged. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but years of discipline kept his voice steady. We'll do the test. After that, we decide what comes next. Claire still didn't speak. Her eyes shimmered with something he couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or defiance, or both. The visit ended with arrangements made, papers signed, a date scheduled. When Ethan left, the sky was already darkening, the ferry's lights visible on the horizon. He paused at the end of her walkway, turning once more toward the house. In the window, he saw her silhouette holding the child, still watching him. As he drove away, the distance between them felt like the wide stretch of water itself, a gulf not just of miles, but of trust broken and years lost. The test would bring answers, but it could not bridge the silence that lay heavy between them. For now, they stood on opposite shores, waiting for a verdict neither could escape. The envelope lay unopened on the table between them, the hospital's seal stamped clean across the front. Claire had set it down hours ago, too afraid to face what it might confirm. Ethan reached for it without hesitation, sliding a finger beneath the flap and pulling out the pages. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the medical jargon until he found the line that mattered. Paternity confirmed. It read. He exhaled, the sound heavy, almost ragged. Claire sat stiff in her chair, arms folded across her chest as if bracing for impact. They're mine, he said, not as a claim, but as a recognition. His gaze lifted, meeting hers. Our children. Something in his voice softened then, the steel replaced by awe. But Claire didn't answer. Her heart thudded with a mix of relief and fear. A truth long hidden was now undeniable, and she couldn't predict what Ethan might do with it. In the weeks that followed, his actions spoke louder than his words. Ethan began appearing on the island regularly, arriving on the morning ferry, his expensive car standing out among the modest vehicles parked near the dock. At first, Claire kept the meetings short, practical. She set rules, supervised visits only, clear start and end times. No disruptions to the children's routine. Ethan agreed without protest. Their first outing was the town library. The triplets toddled between shelves of picture books, their laughter echoing off the quiet walls. Ethan followed awkwardly, stooping his tall frame to keep pace, trying not to look out of place among mothers in jeans and cardigans. He knelt to read aloud from a board book, his voice deep but halting, as though unused to such gentle tones. The children stared at him wide-eyed, then giggled when he made the sound of a cow. Claire watched from a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Later came afternoons at the playground. Ethan stood by the swings, pushing Owen gently, then rushing to catch June at the bottom of the slide. Caleb clung to his leg, babbling nonsense words, and Ethan bent low to listen as if each syllable were the most important in the world. His expensive shoes got caked in sand, his pressed shirts rumpled from sticky hands pulling at him. Yet he didn't complain. Dinner visits followed. Claire cooked simple meals: pasta, roasted chicken, vegetable soup. Ethan sat at the table with a bib around his neck, courtesy of Caleb's mischievous hands, and spoon-fed mashed carrots to a child who spat half of it back. The sight made Claire laugh despite herself, though she quickly covered it. The awkwardness between them remained, but slowly, a fragile rhythm emerged. When business took Ethan back to Seattle or across the country, he insisted on video calls. Each evening at 7, he would appear on Claire's laptop screen, tie loosened, the background shifting from hotel rooms to offices. He read bedtime stories, Goodnight Moon, Where the Wild Things Are, his voice steady, his eyes warming each time the children waved at the camera. The triplets began to expect it, climbing onto Claire's lap as the clock neared 7, chanting "Daddy, Daddy," until the screen lit up. Claire couldn't ignore how much it meant to them, nor how carefully Ethan kept his promise. Still, she guarded her boundaries. After the children went to sleep, She often replayed the evenings in her mind. She noted his effort, his gentleness, his patience, yet doubts lingered. Could this last? Or was it just a burst of guilt and novelty? She measured him day by day, looking for signs of consistency. The test came sooner than she expected. One evening, 7 o'clock arrived and passed. The laptop stayed dark. The children fidgeted, restless. By 7:30, they grew tearful, asking where Daddy was. Claire tried to soothe them, reading a story herself, but their disappointment was raw. When Ethan finally called near 9, the children were already asleep. His face filled the screen, weary and apologetic. "I was stuck in a board meeting," he explained, rubbing his forehead. Claire's jaw tightened. "They waited for you," she said quietly. "They cried." Guilt flickered across his features. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean, don't let it happen again." She cut in, her voice firm. "They need stability. If you want to be in their lives, they come first. Not deals, not meetings, them." For a moment, silence stretched. Then Ethan nodded, his voice low. "You're right. I'll do better." The next day, he showed up early. He brought coloring books and small wooden puzzles, kneeling on the floor to play until the children's giggles filled the room. That night, he called at exactly 7, book in hand, ready before they even sat down. It became a new rule between them. The children were priority. Business could wait. For Ethan, it was an adjustment, one that forced him to reshape his calendar, to decline dinners he once considered essential. For Claire, it was proof that maybe, just maybe, he was learning. Weeks later, a new calendar appeared on the fridge, a gift from a neighbor who had painted it by hand. Each day was marked with colored squares, yellow for school, pink for doctor's appointments, green for grocery runs, and there, in bright blue ink, were blocks labeled Daddy Time. Claire traced the letters with her fingertip one evening after the children had gone to bed. The sight stirred something she couldn't yet name. Trust, perhaps, though fragile. Hope, though cautious. From his side, Ethan felt the shift too. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was beginning to belong, learning one small gesture at a time. The conversation began not with romance, but with paperwork. Ethan arrived at the small house on Whidbey one evening, carrying a slim leather folder, his expression serious. The children had already gone to bed, their soft breaths filling the nursery with a rhythm that steadied Claire even as her nerves tensed. She met him in the kitchen, where the light above the sink cast a muted glow over the worn wooden table. He set the folder down. "Claire, we need to talk about the future." She braced herself. Whenever a man started with those words, it rarely ended in comfort. "I've spoken to my lawyers," he continued, his voice even. "The situation we're in, 3 children. Your name already whispered in certain circles, it leaves you exposed. I can protect them, and you, but only if we make it formal." She stared at him. "Formal marriage," he said simply. "It will secure the children's legal rights, shield you from unwanted press, and provide stability. I can establish a trust fund for their education, health care, property in their names, everything accounted for." Claire folded her arms, her pulse quickening. She had expected many things: arguments over custody, negotiations about time, perhaps even generous financial support. But marriage spoken of like a business merger, her voice came low. "You make it sound like a contract. In some ways, it is," Ethan admitted. "A contract that protects what matters." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint shush of wind outside. Claire studied him, this man of power, this father trying to step into a role he had not chosen but now claimed. She saw the logic in his words, yet her heart rebelled. "You think I'll just move into your penthouse," she said, "become another accessory in your world of polished glass and board meetings." He looked at her steadily. "I don't expect it to be easy, but it's the best way forward." Claire shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "If we do this, it won't be on your terms alone. I have conditions. His brow lifted. I'm listening. One, she said, holding up a finger. We don't live in your penthouse. That place isn't a home. I want Bainbridge Island, a house with a yard, a garden, somewhere the kids can grow up with dirt under their nails and neighbors who know their names. Done, Ethan replied without hesitation. Two, she continued. I keep my independence. I've been supporting us with freelance work and the blog. It may not be much, but it matters. I need to keep working. I need to stand on my own feet. He gave a short nod. Agreed. Three, she said, her voice tightening. This isn't forever, not unless we choose it. We try for 2 years. At the end, we look each other in the eye and decide if it's real, or if it was just duty dressed as love. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. 2 years, he said, and 4. Her eyes held his. Honesty, no pretending, no polished faces for the children. They deserve the truth. They need parents who are real, not actors in some performance. Something shifted in his gaze then, the hardness easing. Honesty, he repeated, no performances. The kitchen fell silent again, but the air felt different, charged, not with hostility, but with the fragile beginnings of understanding. Ethan opened the folder, revealing draft documents with neat columns of provisions. Claire skimmed them, her heart sinking at the sterile language. Custodial rights, financial arrangements, mutual responsibilities. It read like an acquisition deal. She reached for a pen, her hand steady, line by line. She crossed out the words that rang cold. She replaced asset distribution with family support, obligations with commitments. Where the draft spoke of property, she wrote of home. Where they listed terms of care, she wrote of love. When she slid the pages back across the table, Ethan looked at them for a long while. Then he lifted his gaze to hers, something unspoken flickering between them. For the first time, the proposal resembled not just protection, but the outline of a life. Days later, Lydia stepped in to help with the logistics. She coordinated movers, found a realtor willing to keep the transaction discreet, and quietly arranged the transfer to Bainbridge. She even brought over boxes of kitchen supplies, insisting that a home should begin with the smell of cooking. The move was swift, almost surreal. One morning, the family woke in a cramped Whidbey rental with paint peeling from the windowsills. By evening, they stood in a sunlit Bainbridge kitchen with wide counters and a view of the bay. The children darted across the empty living room, their laughter bouncing against bare walls. On the first night, Claire unpacked slowly, stacking dishes into cabinets, spreading her mother's crocheted blankets across the sofa. Ethan carried in cribs, his sleeves rolled up, sweat beading at his temples. He was clumsy with screws and bolts, but he refused to stop until each crib stood sturdy. When the last box was set aside, Claire found a small set of keys on the kitchen counter. The brass glinted beneath the warm light. Beside them, a note in Ethan's neat handwriting read simply, "Home." She picked up the keys, their weight solid in her palm. Through the open window came the sound of waves brushing against the shore, steady and timeless. The air smelled of salt and cedar, a promise of new beginnings. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. The decision had not come from love, not yet, but it had come from something firm: commitment, responsibility, perhaps even the seeds of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt less alone. The Bainbridge house soon filled with the kind of life Claire had always dreamed of. Morning sunlight streamed through wide windows, landing on the rows of tomato plants she and Ethan had planted in the backyard. The vines climbed slowly, their green fruit swelling with promise. Chalk drawings brightened the driveway, swirling stars and stick figures left by little hands. Evenings carried the scent of baked chicken and garlic bread, drifting from the kitchen to the open porch where the family gathered before bedtime. For the first time in years, Claire felt the rhythm of something like peace. Ethan, to her surprise, leaned into it with a quiet determination. He carved out rituals with each child, small traditions that belonged only to them. With Owen, He built wooden models at the kitchen table boats, cars, airplanes, his large hands clumsy with glue but steady with patience. With Caleb, he spread a blanket in the yard after dinner, pointing out constellations and telling stories of hunters, bears, and swans scattered across the night sky. And with June, he sat cross-legged in the living room, listening to the same children's songs on repeat, clapping along until her laughter bubbled loud enough to fill the house. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary, sometimes messy, often imperfect, yet they mattered more than any trust fund or luxury apartment could. Claire watched from the doorway, her heart softening despite the guard she tried to keep in place. But peace has a fragile shell, easily cracked. It happened one Thursday evening at a charity gala in downtown Seattle. Ethan had insisted on attending, a fundraiser for children's hospitals where his company was a major sponsor. Claire stayed home with the triplets, tucking them into bed, then washing dishes while the crickets sang outside. She almost felt safe enough to forget the sharp edges of the world beyond Bainbridge. Meanwhile, under the glittering lights of a hotel ballroom, Ethan crossed paths with a ghost from his past, Victoria Hale. Her entrance turned heads, as it always had. Dark hair swept into an elegant knot, a gown that shimmered like water, a smile honed sharp enough to cut glass. She had been his fiancée once, years ago, before ambition and betrayal tore the engagement apart. Now, her firm handled public relations for several Fortune 500 companies, her influence woven deep into the city's power circuits. She greeted him with practiced warmth. "Ethan, it's been far too long." He forced a polite nod, though tension coiled tight in his chest. Victoria. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, but her eyes searched his face with a knowing glint. She had heard the whispers about the triplets, about the woman on Bainbridge Island. The tabloids were already sniffing, though nothing had surfaced yet. "You've changed," she murmured, her smile never faltering. "Domestic life suits you. But tell me, do you really believe you can sustain it? You've always thrived on the chase, on the challenge. You're not the man who settles." Ethan excused himself soon after, but her words clung like smoke. By the time he returned home on the late ferry, Claire had fallen asleep on the couch, a blanket draped across her lap, a half-finished blog post glowing on the laptop screen. He watched her for a long moment, the quiet strength in her posture, the deep trust his children already placed in her. He wanted to brush aside Victoria's insinuations as poison. Yet somewhere, a sliver of doubt pricked. The following days brought subtle changes. At board meetings, Ethan noticed sideways glances, hushed conversations that stopped when he entered the room. A gossip site ran a blind item about a powerful Northwest executive with a secret family. Reporters had yet to connect dots, but the pressure mounted. His board urged caution, reminding him of pending contracts and fragile alliances. Claire felt the shift too. Ethan grew quieter, distracted. He stayed longer at the office, his phone buzzing with messages he didn't explain. When she asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off with a thin smile. But she recognized the shadow in his eyes. One Saturday afternoon, while the children napped, she stepped onto the porch with a cup of tea. The garden hummed with bees, the air smelled of rosemary and sun-warmed earth, yet her chest felt tight. Victoria had been more than a name in Ethan's past. She had been the symbol of a world Claire had never belonged to, the glittering, ruthless circle of power where affection often masked ambition. If Victoria was back, circling, what did that mean for them? She wrapped her sweater tighter around her, watching the horizon where the sky turned gold over the bay. From inside, the faint sound of Caleb's sleepy murmur drifted through the open window, grounding her in the life she had built. But unease lingered. For the first time since moving into the Bainbridge house, Claire wondered if the peace they had nurtured could truly last. Scandals rarely knock at the door in daylight. They slip in at night, when the house is dark, when a family believes itself safe. It began with a photograph. The image spread quickly online, Ethan Whitaker stepping out of a Lake Union condo late at night beside Marissa Coleman, a well-known attorney in Seattle's healthcare circles. The photo was grainy, shot from across the street, but the headline needed no clarity. Tech Tycoon's Secret Night Out. Claire saw it the next morning on her phone, the screen glowing harsh in the dim kitchen. She sat frozen at the table, her coffee cooling untouched. Marissa's face was turned slightly toward the camera, her expression unreadable. Ethan walked beside her, his coat slung over one arm. It looked like a date, the kind of careless outing powerful men thought they could hide. Her stomach tightened. She had trusted the fragile routine they had built, the nightly calls, the steady presence. Yet now, the world offered a different story, one she hadn't been invited to understand. Then came the email. It landed in inboxes of board members and journalists alike, written in clipped sentences and signed with a forged address. Evidence suggests Whitaker is involved in an inappropriate relationship while hiding a former employee with his children on Bainbridge. Risks to company image are substantial. Attached was a blurred scan of supposed messages, fabricated but believable to anyone already inclined to doubt. The storm gathered fast. The board called Ethan into an emergency session, pressing him for explanations. He told them the truth that Marissa was his counsel on a confidential hospital acquisition, that the meeting had run late, that there was nothing more. But the deal was still under non-disclosure, and he could not reveal details. His silence, meant to honor legal boundaries, looked instead like guilt. Reporters circled, paparazzi parked near the Bainbridge ferry, tabloids dusted off Claire's name, running old photos from corporate directories. Former secretary turns mother of 3. One headline sneered, another went further. How to trap a millionaire inside the life of Ethan Whitaker's secret family. Claire read each word with a sick heaviness. They reduced her to a caricature, the ambitious assistant who had ensnared her boss. They never spoke of the sleepless nights in the NICU, the endless bills, the quiet resilience of survival. They painted her as a schemer, erasing the years of sacrifice. Neighbors on the island began to notice the sudden cameras at the edge of town. Whispers reached her at the grocery store. Even kind faces carried flickers of curiosity that stung. One evening, as dusk settled, Claire stood at the kitchen sink watching the headlights of a car lingering too long at the curb. She felt the walls closing in. The Bainbridge house, once sanctuary, now seemed exposed. She packed quickly, diapers, bottles, blankets, favorite stuffed animals tucked into small arms. She loaded the children into her car and drove north toward Whitby, where an old friend rented cabins near the forest. The ferry rocked gently across the dark water, rain pattering against the windows. Claire kept her head low, her heart pounding each time someone glanced her way. The cabin was simple, just 2 rooms with knotty pine walls and a wood stove that smoked before it warmed. Yet its seclusion offered relief. She laid the children in borrowed cribs, their breathing soft beneath the sound of falling rain. She sat beside them, stroking June's hair, humming a tune her mother once sang. Back in Seattle, Ethan's world tilted further. He read the headlines, heard the whispers from his board, watched his credibility chip away with each unanswered question. He wanted to rush to Claire, to explain, to beg her to believe him. But his hands were tied by the very contract meant to protect a hospital merger. Every word unsaid weighed like stone. Claire, meanwhile, replayed the silence. She thought of the photograph, grainy but powerful, and of Ethan's face when pressed too hard, always retreating into composure. She wanted to trust him. Yet the timing, the secrecy, the relentless pressure of gossip, all of it carved doubts she couldn't easily ignore. That night, she sat on the edge of a narrow bed in the cabin, the children curled together in sleep. Rain drummed steady on the roof, a rhythm like a heartbeat. She pulled her sweater tight and whispered into the shadows, more to herself than anyone listening. They deserve better than uncertainty, better than secrets. Her voice cracked, but the baby stirred only briefly, then settled again. She lay beside them, holding them close, letting their warmth soothe her frayed spirit. Outside, the storm deepened. Inside, she clung to the small truth that remained hers alone. She would protect them. no matter how the world tried to rewrite her story. The phone call came just after dusk. While rain lashed the windows of the cabin, Claire answered cautiously, holding the receiver close so the children wouldn't stir in the next room. "Claire, darling," came the voice, smooth as silk, threaded with false warmth. "Victoria Hale. I hear you've had such a difficult time. The press can be cruel. Ethan can be careless. I know how exposed you must feel out there, alone with 3 little ones. Let me help. I can arrange a seaplane tonight. Discreet. It will take you somewhere safe until the storm passes." Claire's grip tightened. Something in the polished tone rang wrong. She pictured herself stepping onto a small plane in the dark, handing her children over to a woman who thrived on control. Her instinct screamed no. "Thank you," she said evenly. "But we're fine here." She hung up before Victoria could reply. Hours later, news reached the island. A seaplane had been forced into an emergency landing due to engine failure. No lives lost. But the incident confirmed what Claire already feared. Victoria's promise of safety had been a trap, designed to uproot her, to twist the story further. The storm outside swelled to match the turmoil in her chest. Winds howled through the trees, bending branches like bows. The ferry service shut down, leaving the island isolated until morning. Claire checked the locks on the cabin doors, fed more wood to the stove, and curled her children close. She whispered prayers into the crackling flames, uncertain if anyone was listening. Meanwhile, across the dark waters of Puget Sound, Ethan made his choice. He had heard of Victoria's call through Lydia, who pieced together the threads with sharp intuition. Rage burned through him, but beneath it was fear, the possibility that Claire might have accepted, that he could lose them all in a single reckless scheme. When he reached the ferry dock, he was told the service was suspended. "No crossings until morning," the attendant said, shrugging at the sheets of rain slamming against the pier. But morning was too late. An old fisherman, skin weathered and eyes steady, stood nearby, checking lines on his small boat. Ethan approached him without hesitation. "I need to cross." "Tonight?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Not in this storm. Not unless you're desperate." "I am," Ethan said simply. Minutes later, the boat pitched into the waves, lantern light swaying wildly as rain soaked them both. Ethan gripped the wheel when the fisherman's hands grew tired, his knuckles white, palms slipping on the slick wood. Salt spray stung his eyes, the cold biting through his expensive coat until he felt stripped bare. Each mile was a battle. Waves crashed high, lifting the vessel then slamming it down again. His hands bled where rope burned against skin, but he refused to let go. For once, no boardroom strategy, no corporate mask mattered. Only the thought of Claire and the 3 children waiting in the dark kept him upright. He remembered Owen's shy smile when he built model boats, Caleb's laugh beneath the stars, June's tiny hands clapping to songs. They were worth more than his reputation, more than contracts and headlines. If the sea demanded a toll, he would pay it gladly. By the time the boat reached Whidbey, Ethan was drenched, clothes plastered to his skin, hair dripping into his eyes. His shoulders ached, his palms raw and red. One split open where the rope had bitten deepest. But his resolve had not cracked. He staggered up the muddy path toward the cabin, lantern light glowing faintly through the rain. His shoes sank into wet earth, each step heavy, yet he pressed on. Inside, Claire sat on the couch with the children curled against her. The storm roared beyond the walls, but the fire cast a circle of fragile warmth. At the sound of footsteps on the porch, her heart leapt. She rose, clutching June to her chest, and opened the door. Ethan stood there, dripping, battered, eyes fierce with determination. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The storm raged behind him. The hearth glowed behind her. Between them hung everything unsaid: fear, betrayal, longing, and the stubborn thread of connection that had refused to break. Claire reached for the doorframe, steadying herself. His presence was a shock, but also a strange relief. He had come, against reason, against weather, Against pride, he had chosen them. Ethan met her gaze, chest rising with ragged breath. "I'm here," he said simply. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of truth. Rain dripped from his coat onto the wooden floor. Claire hesitated only a moment before stepping back, letting the door swing wider. The warmth of the cabin spilled outward, meeting the storm. As Ethan crossed the threshold, the distance between them narrowed, not with words, but with the raw proof of effort. He had risked everything to return. Behind them, the children stirred, their soft murmurs rising above the steady drum of rain. The house, fragile yet steadfast, held all of them within. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something like hope flickered back to life. The storm passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean, the sky washed in pale light. For the first time in days, Claire opened the cabin windows. Damp earth and cedar drifted in, cool and sharp. The children pressed their noses to the glass, pointing at puddles sparkling in the yard. Ethan stood outside, phone in hand, shoulders squared. The fight wasn't finished yet. Storms didn't end just because the rain stopped. Back in Seattle, Lydia moved swiftly. She had always been the steady anchor in Ethan's life, less visible than the boardroom or the headlines, but no less powerful. She assembled a small team of the company's legal staff, sharp-eyed and relentless. They traced the blurred photo, not to gossip sites, but to its source. Metadata told the truth. The image had been cropped, filtered, and sent through a private account that connected back to Victoria's firm. The fake email, too, crumbled under scrutiny. The return address, supposedly internal, was traced to a server Victoria's agency leased for off-site projects. Every breadcrumb led back to her, no matter how carefully she had tried to cover the trail. Claire listened as Lydia explained it all over speakerphone one evening, her voice steady but fierce. Claire sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, trying to absorb the details. She didn't understand every technical word, but she understood the heart of it. Victoria had built the story, planted the poison, and fanned the flames. Still, proof wasn't enough. The world needed a witness. That came from Marissa Coleman herself. She stepped forward, calm and unflinching, confirming that the late-night meeting at the Lake Union condo had been nothing but business. She explained that the deal in question was to secure funding for a struggling community hospital, and Ethan had spent the night in the executive suite after hours of tense negotiation. She looked directly at the cameras when she spoke, making it impossible to twist her words. The photographs were misleading. Marissa said, "Mr. Whitaker was never inappropriate. He was working to save a hospital that serves thousands of families. I was there, I know." The board, pressured by growing evidence and Marissa's testimony, had little choice. Within a week, they voted to suspend all contracts with Victoria's agency, citing ethical breaches. Quietly, other companies followed, pulling accounts, severing ties, and the press, so quick to shout suspicion, began to turn. Headlines shifted. Tone PR queen under fire for fabricated scandal. Whitaker cleared by colleagues' testimony. A smaller piece ran in the local paper with Claire's name in the headline, not as scandal, but as vindication. Island mother targeted in smear campaign. When Claire read it, her eyes stung. The words didn't undo the months of whispers, the cruel stares, the sleepless nights of doubt, but they gave her something she hadn't dared hope for: a public clearing of her name. Ethan returned to Bainbridge late that night, his car headlights sweeping across the gravel drive. He stepped inside, setting his briefcase down without ceremony. The children squealed, rushing to him, clinging to his legs until he knelt to gather them close. Claire stood by the stove, stirring soup, watching silently. "It's over," he said, his voice low. "The lies are finished." She turned slowly, ladle still in her hand. Are they? His eyes met hers. Yes. They can't touch you now. Her throat tightened. For weeks she had felt like a character in someone else's script, cast as the villain without consent. Now, for the first time, the narrative belonged to her again. She let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Dinner that evening felt almost ordinary, and perhaps that was the greatest gift. The triplets laughed over buttered rolls, spilling juice on the table. Ethan cut their food into small pieces, his shirt sleeves still damp from rain. Claire served bowls of soup, the smell of carrots and thyme filling the kitchen. When the meal ended, Lydia called once more. "The board has issued a formal statement," she said. "They're standing behind Ethan, and behind you, Claire." Tears pricked her eyes, unexpected and hot. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt too small. After the children were tucked into bed, Claire stepped onto the porch. The bay shimmered in the moonlight, the sound of water gentle against the shore. She folded her arms against the cool air, letting the quiet seep into her bones. Ethan joined her, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. They stood in silence, watching the sky. The truth had won, not because of loud arguments or bitter fights, but because the facts had surfaced, clear and undeniable, like sunlight after storm. Behind them, the Bainbridge house glowed with warmth. Inside, 3 children slept soundly. Inside, dinner dishes waited in the sink, the ordinary mess of family life. And for the first time, that ordinariness felt like triumph. Claire turned toward the doorway, where lamplight spilled across the porch. She caught Ethan watching her, his expression unreadable but softened. She didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, or whether trust could fully mend. But tonight, at least, the shadows had retreated, and tonight, that was enough. Ethan waited until the house grew quiet, until the triplets' giggles faded into steady breathing behind closed doors. The kitchen was dim except for the soft light above the sink. Claire stood at the counter folding small shirts, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. She didn't look up when he entered, but she felt the shift in the air. "I need to say something," he began. His voice carried none of the confidence he wore in boardrooms. It was stripped bare, uncertain, like a man standing on uneven ground. Claire paused, folding half done, and turned toward him. "I failed you," Ethan said simply. "Not just with the lies Victoria spread. I failed because I gave silence more power than truth. I put contracts, negotiations, image everything before your trust. I thought I was protecting us, but really, I was protecting myself." The admission hung heavy between them. Claire swallowed hard, her eyes narrowing not with anger, but with the weight of being seen. "I don't need a perfect man," she whispered. "I needed an honest one." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Then let me start over. I've spoken to the board. I'm stepping back. Fewer deals, fewer flights, no more excuses about missing calls or late nights when I should be here. I want my children to know me not from headlines, but from bedtime stories. And I want you to know me without walls." Claire's chest tightened. She searched his face, looking for cracks, for performance. But what she saw was resolve, not the driven CEO, but a man choosing differently. "And us?" she asked, her voice fragile. Ethan reached for the folder that had once held contracts and conditions. This time, he slid across a single page with handwriting. "Not legal print, no more trial period," he said. "No more conditions, not a contract, not a test. I want this marriage because I want you, because I love the family we've built, even when it's messy, even when it's hard, especially then." The words struck something deep inside her, a place she had kept locked. For years, fear had been her armor, fear of judgment, of abandonment, of repeating the mistakes she had seen her own mother endure. But as she stood in that Bainbridge kitchen, with Ethan's voice steady and the house filled with the scent of tomato soup still lingering from dinner, she felt the armor crack. It wasn't just Ethan who had to change. She did too. Her greatest fear had not been losing him. It had been trusting him, and in doing so, risking everything. Now she realized that holding back was its own kind of loss. Claire placed the folded shirt on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am too," Ethan said. but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The words unlocked something in her. Tears welled, not of pain, but of release. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. His arms wrapped around her, not as a shield, but as a homecoming. For the first time since Sun Valley, since that night that had begun everything, Claire allowed herself to rest in his embrace without conditions. Not because she had no choice, but because she chose it freely. Later. They sat side by side on the couch, the page with Ethan's handwritten promise lying on the coffee table. No grand vows, no public spectacle, just two people deciding, again and again, to stay. The sound of little feet broke the moment. Owen peeked out from the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Daddy, Mommy, story." Claire laughed softly, wiping her cheeks. Ethan stood, scooping his son into his arms. "Of course," he said, his voice warm. Caleb and June followed, dragging blankets, their voices tumbling over each other. The family settled onto the big bed, picture book open, children pressed close. Ethan read, his voice carrying the rhythm of promise, while Claire watched the corners of his mouth lift in quiet joy. And when the children drifted to sleep, their small hands curled around his shirt, Claire caught his gaze across the pillows. For the first time, she let her smile reach her eyes. It wasn't perfection. It was better truth, fear, and love woven into something strong enough to hold them all. The morning air carried the crisp scent of fall across Bainbridge Island. Leaves, painted in shades of amber and crimson, drifted lazily from maple branches onto the wooden porch. Claire adjusted the thick wool scarf around her neck and noticed the little shoes lined up neatly beside Ethan's worn leather boots. A quiet joy settled in her chest, gentle and unassuming. Ethan poured steaming mugs of apple cider onto the small tray, the sweet aroma mingling with the earthy scent of turned soil from the vegetable garden. The triplets scampered around, collecting tiny pumpkins and marveling at the colorful leaves spinning in the breeze. Caleb held one high, declaring it the king of autumn, while Owen and June attempted to balance theirs on the porch railing. Claire smiled, letting her gaze drift over the backyard. Tomato vines had shrunk back for the season, but their scarlet fruit still peeked from green leaves. A neighbor's basket of homemade apple preserves rested on the fence post, and the faint laughter of children from nearby homes drifted through the crisp morning air. Ethan knelt beside the triplets, guiding their tiny hands as they traced shapes in the fallen leaves. "Point to the big maple," he encouraged. The children squealed, reaching for the largest tree at the edge of the yard. Their voices mingled with the distant caw of crows and the whisper of wind through the branches. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the past month's ease. Every sleepless night, every worry about contracts, every whispered fear of exposure, every silent struggle in the NICU they had led her here. Here, to a home built not from money, not from prestige, but from daily choices, from honest effort, and from the courage to let love guide them. Ethan noticed her gaze and followed it, resting his hand on hers. Their fingers interlaced naturally, the size difference a quiet reminder of their roles in this little world, his strength, her patience. "It's good," he said softly. "We did good." Claire nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We did," she echoed, watching as the triplets pointed to the first stars beginning to appear in the early evening sky. Each child's finger stretched upward, a miniature declaration of wonder. Dinner was simple, but warm, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a pumpkin pie that filled the porch with sweetness. The children passed dishes, proudly offering portions to each other and to their parents. Ethan carved the pie while Claire poured cider, and for a moment, the world outside its pressures, its judgments, its relentless pace felt distant and irrelevant. Afterward, they stepped back onto the porch to watch the sunset. The horizon blushed with gold and rose, the water of Puget Sound catching the light in trembling reflections. The triplets chattered about which stars were constellations and which were special wishes. Ethan and Claire leaned against each other, heads close, listening to the quiet symphony of their small, ordinary happiness. Claire reflected on how far they had come. The initial shock, the fear, the isolation, the lonely nights in Seattle, all the way to this porch where laughter replaced worry, and love replaced fear. Money could build doors, but it could not create the safety she felt here. Only honesty, daily attention, and the willingness to be vulnerable had done that. Ethan nudged her gently. "Remember Sun Valley," he whispered. She nodded, recalling the snow, the lonesome hallways, the weight of decisions unmade. "And now?" he asked. She laughed softly, the sound mingling with the sigh of autumn wind. "Now, we keep building," she replied. The children ran to the edge of the porch, each grabbing a leaf in their tiny hands. They waved it toward the sky as if sending messages of joy. Claire watched, the warmth of the day settling in her bones, the realization that contentment need not be loud or dramatic. Sometimes the pinnacle of happiness was subtle, a shared glance, the scent of cider, a hand held without words, the knowledge that each day, effort and care would continue to shape this home. Ethan crouched to lift each child's hand into his, guiding them back toward the kitchen door. Their laughter bubbled up, unself-conscious and free. Claire followed, pausing to brush a curl from her face, taking a last look at the porch now scattered with leaves and soft shadows. At the door, she stopped. Ethan noticed and raised an eyebrow, thinking he asked quietly. She nodded, just thinking how ordinary things feel like miracles, she said. Ethan smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Every day," he said, "every single day." Inside, the warm glow from the lights met them. The children settled into blankets on the sofa, their favorite storybook open between them. Claire and Ethan sank into the chairs on either side, watching as their family unfolded in gentle rhythm. No dramatic confessions, no public fanfare, only the quiet knowledge that trust, perseverance, and shared effort had crafted something lasting. Claire glanced at the small hands reaching toward Ethan's, and then at his large, steady ones returning the grasp. She felt the pulse of life, love, and commitment in that simple connection. The porch, the garden, the fallen leaves outside, all were witnesses to a promise renewed, every day, in gestures big and small. As night settled, the first stars glimmered fully above the Bainbridge skies. Ethan's voice read aloud, slow and tender, while Claire followed with soft interjections, creating a rhythm that lulled children into slumber. The air smelled faintly of pine, cider, and autumn soil. Peace had been earned, quietly, courageously, and truthfully. And in that shared silence between the reading and the breathing of sleeping children, Claire realized that happiness did not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it came as a quiet warmth, a clasped hand, a home filled with love and the daily work of being together. Life often presents us with unexpected challenges, moments that test our resilience, patience, and capacity for love. Claire's journey reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the quiet determination to face uncertainty with integrity. Even when circumstances seem overwhelming, raising 3 children alone, navigating judgment, or confronting past mistakes, compassion and steadfastness can guide us through. Ethan's story teaches that power and wealth mean little without responsibility, honesty, and the willingness to prioritize relationships over ego or career. True strength lies in vulnerability, in admitting errors, and in making deliberate choices to nurture trust and family. For anyone at any stage of life, this story underscores the importance of empathy, communication, and the courage to embrace change. It reminds us that love, when grounded in respect, patience, and commitment, can overcome misunderstandings, heal old wounds, and create a life rich in connection and meaning. Ultimately, the greatest lessons emerge from ordinary moments: the bedtime stories, shared meals, quiet walks, and hands held in solidarity. These are the threads that weave lasting joy, teaching us that it is never too late to build, to forgive, and to love wholeheartedly. Thank you so much for joining us on this heartfelt journey. Your time, attention, and support mean the world. If this story touched you, please give it a like, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that warm the heart. Every click helps us bring more stories of courage, love, and hope to you.